Some bonds form in the most unexpected places, when two lonely souls recognize something familiar in each other's eyes. When you've lost everything that matters, sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely source. Tahsina, a proud Apache woman living alone on the edge of Cedar Ridge, never planned to leave the livestock auction with anything more than disappointment. But there, chained and feared by every settler in town, stood a dog unlike any she'd ever seen, massive as a small horse, with ancient eyes that seemed to understand her grief. The townsfolk laughed when she offered her late husband's silver brooch for the beast they all considered dangerous. But something passed between woman and dog in that moment, a recognition deeper than words. The giant creature chose her just as she chose him. What happened next would change everything, not just for Tahsina, but for the entire town of Cedar Ridge. What secret was this legendary dog hiding that would shake everyone's understanding of what they thought they knew? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered boards of Tahsina's cabin as she sat on her front porch, watching her new companion explore the small yard with careful, deliberate steps. 3 days had passed since the auction, and still the dog moved like he was learning the boundaries of his new world. He was magnificent, standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder, with a coat that shifted between grey and silver, depending on how the light caught it. His massive head turned toward her, and those ancient eyes held a wisdom that made her breath catch. "What are you, old friend?" she whispered in Apache, her native tongue feeling more natural when speaking to this creature who seemed to understand things beyond the reach of ordinary animals. The dog's ears pricked forward at her words, and he padded over to settle beside her chair. Even sitting, his head came to her elbow. She reached out tentatively and ran her fingers through his thick fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. For the first time since her husband Joseph's death 2 winters ago, the silence of her home didn't feel quite so heavy. Cedar Ridge sprawled below them in the valley, a town caught between 2 worlds. The older section clustered around the original trading post, where weathered log buildings housed the blacksmith, general store, and saloon that had served travelers for decades. But newer construction spread eastward, crisp lumber and fresh paint marking the arrival of families who'd come west seeking their fortune. The railroad hadn't reached them yet, but everyone knew it was coming. You could see it in the way certain men carried themselves, the way conversations stopped when strangers passed through town. Tahsina had lived on the edge of both worlds her entire life. Her father had been Apache, her mother half Pueblo, and she'd grown up straddling the line between tribal traditions and the encroaching white settlement. When she'd married Joseph Running Bear 23 years ago, they'd built this cabin deliberately apart from town, close enough to trade and work, far enough to maintain their own way of life. Joseph had been a bridge himself, respected by both communities for his skill with horses and his quiet wisdom. The townspeople had trusted him with their most difficult animals, and he'd never failed to gentle even the wildest Mustang. But when the fever took him, Tahsina found herself truly alone for the first time, navigating a world that seemed less interested in bridges and more focused on choosing sides. She kept herself busy with the small garden behind the cabin, the few chickens that provided eggs for trade, and the intricate beadwork that brought in enough money to supplement her modest savings. But the evening stretched long and silent, filled only with the sounds of wind through the pines and the distant calls of night birds, until now. The dog lifted his great head and gazed toward town, his body growing alert. Tahsina followed his line of sight and spotted a rider approaching up the winding path. She recognized the steady gait of Samuel Morrison's bay mare before she could make out the man himself. Sam ran the general store and had been one of Joseph's closest friends among the townspeople. "Morning, Tahsina," Sam called as he dismounted near her gate. He was a big man with graying hair and kind eyes, but today his usual easy smile seemed forced. "Thought I'd check on you and your new friend here." The dog remained perfectly still, watching Sam with an intensity that made the older man shift uncomfortably in his saddle. "He's settling in well," Tahsina replied, keeping her voice neutral. She'd learned long ago to let others reveal their intentions before showing her own hand. Sam glanced around the yard, taking in the neat garden, the well-maintained cabin, the sense of peaceful order that she'd worked hard to maintain. "He's certainly impressive. Some of the folks in town are saying he might be part wolf." "People say many things." Tahsina's fingers found the spot behind the dog's ears, and she felt him lean slightly into her touch. "Most of them know nothing about wolves or dogs." "That's true enough." Sam cleared his throat. "The thing is, there's been some talk. Nothing serious, you understand, but some concerns about having such a large animal so close to town. Especially with children playing around the creek and all." The dog's ears flattened slightly, and Tahsina felt a low rumble build in his chest. Not quite a growl, but a sound that made Sam take a step backward. "Has he threatened anyone?" Tahsina asked quietly. "Well, no, not exactly threatened. Has he left my property without permission?" "No, but then perhaps the people in town should concern themselves with their own animals." Tahsina's voice carried the kind of quiet steel that Joseph had always admired. "I've seen more damage done by old Pete's goats than by any creature I've brought home." Sam chuckled despite himself. Pete's notorious goats had indeed caused their share of trouble, eating laundry off lines and trampling gardens with impunity. "You've got a point there. I told Mayor Collins you'd never keep anything truly dangerous. It's just that some folks are nervous about change, you know? Change." The word hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Everyone in Cedar Ridge was nervous about change these days. The territory was shifting towards statehood, bringing new laws and new expectations. Railroad surveyors had been spotted in the region, and rumors flew about which routes they might choose. Land that had been worthless scrub a decade ago suddenly held the promise of prosperity or the threat of displacement. "I appreciate you coming out here, Sam," Tahsina said. "But this one stays with me." Sam nodded, clearly relieved to have delivered his message without confrontation. As he prepared to mount his horse, the dog rose to his feet with fluid grace and padded to the edge of the porch. He stood there like a sentinel, watching the visitor with those unsettling eyes. "Take care of yourself, Tahsina," Sam said, swinging up into his saddle. "And maybe keep him close to home for a while, until folks get used to the idea." She watched him ride away until he disappeared around the bend, then turned to study her companion. The dog had remained perfectly still throughout the entire conversation, but she'd felt the subtle changes in his posture, the way his attention had focused on Sam's words and movements. It was almost as if he'd understood every word. "What do you think, old friend?" she murmured. "Should we worry about what the townspeople say?" The dog looked up at her with those ancient eyes, and for a moment she could have sworn she saw something like amusement flickering in their depths. Then he turned and padded back to his favorite spot in the shade of the old oak tree, settling down to watch the road with the patience of something that had been waiting a very long time. That evening, as Tahsina prepared her simple supper, she found herself moving around the kitchen with less of the mechanical precision that had marked her routines since Joseph's death. The dog lay near the fireplace, his massive form somehow managing to look both protective and peaceful. Occasionally, she caught herself speaking to him as she worked, sharing thoughts about the weather, the garden, the small concerns of daily life. When she finally sat down to eat, she realized she'd prepared portions for two without thinking. The habit of caring for someone other than herself was returning slowly, like water seeping back into dry ground. She saved half her bread and meat, carrying it outside to where the dog waited patiently. He accepted the food with dignity, eating slowly and deliberately, never snatching or gulping like the half-wild dogs that sometimes wandered through the area. Everything about him spoke of intelligence and restraint, of a creature who understood his place in the world, even if others couldn't see it. As darkness settled over the mountains, Tahsina found herself on the porch again, wrapped in one of Joseph's old blankets. The dog lay at her feet, his breathing deep and even. Stars emerged one by one overhead, the same constellations her grandmother had taught her to read as a child. Stories lived in those patterns, tales of heroes and spirits, of journeys that spanned both the earthly and sacred worlds. "My grandmother would have liked you," she told the dog softly. "She always said the spirits sometimes wore different shapes when they walked among us." The dog's tail thumped once against the porch boards, and Tahsina smiled despite herself. Perhaps Sam was right about one thing. Change was coming to Cedar Ridge, whether they welcomed it or not. But maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face it alone. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley, still miles away but growing closer with each passing day. The sound carried promises and threats in equal measure, and Tahsina pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders. Whatever was coming, she would meet it as she always had, with quiet strength and the wisdom of those who had walked this land long before the first railroad spike was driven. The dog raised his great head toward the sound, his ears pricked forward in alert attention. Then he looked back at Tahsina, and in his ancient eyes she saw something that made her heart steady, the unmistakable look of a guardian who had finally found something worth protecting. The first surveyor arrived on a Tuesday morning when the mountain air still carried the bite of dawn frost. Tahsina spotted him from her garden, where she'd been harvesting the last of the season's squash. He was a young man with pale skin that spoke of eastern cities, wearing clothes too fine for rough country travel. His horse picked its way carefully up the mountain path, clearly unused to the rocky terrain. The dog emerged from beneath the porch at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, moving with that fluid grace that never failed to surprise her. He positioned himself between the cabin and the newcomer, not aggressive, but unmistakably present. His massive frame caught the morning light, making him appear even larger than his already considerable size. "Good morning, ma'am," the surveyor called out, pulling up short when he caught sight of the dog. His horse pranced nervously, responding to its rider's sudden tension. "I'm looking for Mrs. Tahsina Running Bear." "You found her." Tahsina straightened slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. She noticed how the young man's eyes kept darting to the dog, who remained motionless as carved stone. "What brings you up the mountain?" The surveyor dismounted, though he kept his horse between himself and the dog. From his saddlebags, he withdrew a leather portfolio thick with papers. "Name's William Cartwright, ma'am. I represent the Colorado and Pacific Railroad Company. We're conducting preliminary surveys for potential rail routes through this territory." Tahsina felt her stomach tighten, though her expression remained neutral. The railroad had been a distant threat for so long that its sudden proximity felt like watching storm clouds gather on a clear day. "This is tribal land, Mr. Cartwright, protected by treaty." "Well, ma'am, that's partly what I'm here to discuss." Cartwright opened his portfolio and withdrew a map covered in red lines and surveyor's marks. "There have been some developments regarding the legal status of certain land parcels in this area." The dog's ears flattened slightly, and Tahsina noticed how his attention had focused entirely on the papers in Cartwright's hands. It was as if he could sense the threat those documents represented, without understanding the specific words. "What kind of developments?" Cartwright unfolded the map, revealing a detailed survey of the entire valley. Red lines crisscrossed the landscape like arteries, and Tahsina could see her own property marked with careful precision. "The territorial government has been reviewing old land grants and treaty obligations. Some irregularities have come to light regarding the original boundaries established in the 1868 agreement." Tahsina's hands clenched at her sides. The Treaty of 1868 had been her people's last real protection, establishing clear boundaries for Apache lands in exchange for peace. If those boundaries were being questioned now, when the territory was pushing towards statehood, it could only mean one thing. "Irregularities," she repeated, tasting the bitter word. "Yes, ma'am. It appears that certain sections of land, including this property, may have been incorrectly classified as tribal holdings when they should have been designated as territorial land available for private purchase." Cartwright's voice carried the practiced smoothness. of someone who delivered this news before. The railroad company is prepared to offer fair compensation for any inconvenience, of course. The dog rose to his feet with deliberate slowness, and Cartwright took an involuntary step backward. There was something in the animal's posture that spoke of barely contained power, like a spring wound tight and ready to release. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations," Tahsina said quietly. "My grandfather built the first shelter here. My husband and I raised our marriage lodge in that clearing. We're buried here. Our ancestors, our children who didn't survive their first winters. I understand the sentimental value, Ma'am. Truly I do. But the law is the law. And if these boundaries were incorrectly drawn, the boundaries were drawn by men who walked this land, who knew every creek and ridge and meadow." Tahsina's voice carried the weight of generations. "Not by politicians in Washington who've never seen a mountain except in photographs." Cartwright shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to this level of resistance. "Perhaps we could discuss the specifics of the railroad's offer. The company is prepared to be quite generous, especially for prime road property like this." He gestured toward the map, where Tahsina could now see that the red line representing the proposed railroad ran directly through her property, bisecting the meadow where Joseph's grave lay beneath a cairn of river stones. The dog took 3 steps forward, and Cartwright's horse shied so violently that the young man had to grab the bridle to keep from losing his mount entirely. "Ma'am, perhaps you could restrain your animal." "He's not restrained because he doesn't need to be." Tahsina's eyes never left the map. "Unless someone gives him cause." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Cartwright rolled up his documents with hands that weren't quite steady. "I'll need to file my survey report with the territorial office, ma'am. Someone from the land office will be in touch about the formal proceedings. You do that." Tahsina crossed her arms. "And when they come, they'd better bring proof that these irregularities are anything more than convenient lies." After Cartwright rode away, picking his way down the mountain path with considerably more haste than he'd shown climbing up, Tahsina stood in her garden for a long time, staring at the mountains that had sheltered her family for so many years. The dog padded over to stand beside her, his massive head brushing against her shoulder. "They mean to take it all, don't they?" she murmured. The dog made a sound deep in his throat, not quite a growl, but something that spoke of understanding and shared anger. When she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her catch her breath. For just a moment, they seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the morning sun. That afternoon brought visitors of a different sort. Tahsina was mending harness leather on her porch when she heard the familiar sound of horses approaching from town. This time, it was Mayor Collins himself, accompanied by Sam Morrison and 2 men she didn't recognize. The dog appeared from wherever he'd been resting, taking his usual position between the cabin and the approaching riders. Mayor Collins was a stout man with political ambitions that exceeded his small-town circumstances. He dismounted with the careful dignity of someone conscious of his importance, though Tahsina noticed how his eyes kept tracking to the dog. "Mrs. Running Bear," he began formally, "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but we need to discuss some urgent matters concerning the welfare of our community. If this is about the railroad man's visit this morning..." "Word travels fast." Collins looked surprised. "You've already spoken with the survey team?" Actually, that makes this easier. These gentlemen represent the Territorial Land Commission." He gestured to the 2 strangers, both of whom had the pale, soft look of men who spent their time in offices rather than outdoors. The older of the 2 stepped forward, consulting a notebook thick with official seals. "Mrs. Running Bear, I'm Commissioner Hughes from the Territorial Capital. This is my assistant, Mr. Drake. We're here to inform you that formal proceedings have been initiated regarding the legal status of this property." Tahsina felt the world tilt slightly, the way it had when the doctor told her Joseph's fever wouldn't break. "Formal proceedings. Yes, ma'am." The territorial government has determined that significant portions of what was previously considered Apache land may have been incorrectly surveyed in the original treaty boundaries. Until the matter can be resolved in court, all development and improvement of disputed properties must cease. This is my home. The words came out flatter than she'd intended. Commissioner Hughes consulted his notebook again. According to our records, no formal deed exists for this specific parcel. The original treaty granted general territorial rights to the Apache people, but individual property ownership was never properly documented according to territorial law. Sam Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. And now wait a minute, Commissioner. Joseph Running Bear was known and respected in this community for 20 years. Nobody ever questioned his right to this land. I'm sure Mr. Running Bear was a fine man, Hughes replied, with the patient tone of someone explaining simple facts to children. But respect and legal ownership are two different things. The railroad company has filed a legitimate claim on this property for purposes of territorial development. The dog took a step forward, and suddenly the horses began to dance nervously. Commissioner Hughes's mount actually tried to back away, forcing him to grip the saddle horn to keep his seat. Furthermore, Hughes continued, his voice rising slightly, there have been reports of dangerous animals being harbored on the property. For public safety reasons, all large predators must be removed or destroyed. The word destroyed seemed to hang in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Tahsina felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. This dog has never threatened anyone. Ma'am, I've seen the reports. That animal is nearly the size of a horse, and several witnesses have described behavior that suggests wolf breeding. Territorial law is very clear about the keeping of dangerous predators near settled areas. Mayor Collins cleared his throat diplomatically. Now, Commissioner, perhaps we don't need to take such drastic measures immediately. Mrs. Running Bear is a valued member of our community. The law is the law, Mayor Collins. This territory is seeking statehood, which means we must demonstrate our ability to maintain order and safety according to federal standards. Hughes snapped his notebook shut. Mrs. Running Bear, you have 30 days to vacate this property and remove all animals. After that, territorial marshals will be authorized to use whatever force is necessary. 30 days. The number echoed in Tahsina's mind like the countdown to execution. 30 days to abandon everything she'd built, everything she'd loved, everything that connected her to the world she'd known. The dog moved again, positioning himself directly in front of the officials. He didn't growl or show teeth, but something in his posture made all 4 horses begin to back away, despite their riders' efforts to control them. "Ma'am," Commissioner Hughes called out as his horse continued to retreat, "I strongly advise you not to resist these proceedings. The territorial government has resources at its disposal that you cannot match." As the official party rode away, their horses still skittish and eager to distance themselves from the dog, Tahsina sank into her porch chair. 30 days to lose everything. 30 days before they came with guns and legal papers to tear down the life she'd built stone by stone. The dog padded up the porch steps and settled beside her chair with that careful grace. When she reached out to stroke his massive head, she felt the steady strength of him, the sense of something ancient and unshakable that had somehow chosen to stand with her. "What are we going to do, old friend?" she whispered. The dog lifted his great head and looked toward town, where smoke rose from chimneys and the sounds of daily life continued unchanged. Then he looked back at Tahsina, and in his ancient eyes she saw something that made her spine straighten. They might have legal papers and government backing. They might have money and political influence and the weight of an entire territory behind them, but they didn't understand what they were truly up against. The path to the reservation wound through pine forests and rocky outcroppings that had remained unchanged since Tahsina's childhood. She rode her mare slowly, conscious of the dog padding alongside with that tireless gait that seemed to cover ground without effort. 2 days had passed since the official's visit, and she'd spent the nights lying awake, staring at the cabin ceiling and listening to the dog's steady breathing from his place by the fireplace. She needed answers, and there was only one place to find them. The reservation settlement appeared gradually through the trees, a collection of government-built houses, interspersed with traditional structures that spoke of a people adapting to circumstances beyond their control. Smoke rose from cooking fires where women prepared the morning meal, and children played in the dusty spaces between buildings. It was a far cry from the scattered mountain settlements of her childhood, when Apache families had moved freely across vast territories according to the seasons. As they approached the central area, Tahsina noticed how conversation stopped and heads turned. Some of the attention was for her. She was known here, though she rarely visited, but most eyes were drawn to the massive dog walking calmly at her horse's side. Children peered out from behind their mothers' skirts, and even the adults stepped back to give them passage. The dog seemed unaware of the stir he was causing. His attention focused on something ahead that Tahsina couldn't yet see. His ears were pricked forward, and she noticed a subtle change in his posture that spoke of recognition. Tahsina. The voice came from the doorway of one of the older buildings, a structure that had been built in the traditional way with local materials. Joseph White Hawk emerged into the sunlight, and Tahsina felt her breath catch. The old medicine man was well past 80, his long hair white as snow, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the most respected spiritual leaders among their people. "Grandfather," she said, using the title of respect as she dismounted, "I need guidance." White Hawk's gaze moved from Tahsina to the dog, and something flickered across his weathered features. "Yes," he said quietly, "I thought you might." As they approached, the dog stopped abruptly. He stood perfectly still, his head raised toward the old man with an intensity that made Tahsina's skin prickle. White Hawk studied the animal for a long moment, then said something in the old Apache tongue, words so ancient that Tahsina could barely make out their meaning. The dog's response was immediate and startling. He lowered his massive head in what could only be described as a bow, holding the position for several heartbeats before rising again to meet White Hawk's eyes. "Come inside," the old man said, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there moments before. "Both of you. We have much to discuss." The interior of White Hawk's dwelling was dim and cool, smelling of sage and leather and the deeper sense of ceremony. Traditional items hung from the walls, eagle feathers, painted shields, bundles of herbs wrapped in hide. But it was the object on the central table that drew Tahsina's attention, a small leather pouch, intricately beaded with patterns that seemed to shift in the flickering light from the fire. "The railroad men came to you," White Hawk said, as he settled onto a woven mat. "It wasn't a question. 2 days ago. They claimed the land boundaries were drawn incorrectly, that my property belongs to the territory." Tahsina knelt across from him, the dog settling beside her with careful precision. "They want to build their railroad through my husband's grave." White Hawk nodded slowly. "The same claim they've used to take 3 other properties this month. Always the same story: boundary errors, legal irregularities, territorial rights." He picked up the beaded pouch, cradling it in hands that showed the marks of decades of hard work. "But you didn't come here just about land disputes." Tahsina glanced at the dog, who was watching White Hawk with that unsettling intensity. "There's something about him, grandfather. Something I don't understand. Tell me about the auction." She described that strange day when she'd gone to town with nothing but hope and desperation. How the sight of the massive dog had struck her. Like lightning, how he'd chosen her when she offered the silver brooch. White Hawk listened without interruption, his fingers tracing the beadwork on the medicine pouch. "You said he recognized your grief," the old man said when she finished. "It sounds foolish when I say it aloud. Grief calls to grief, child. Pain recognizes pain." White Hawk set the pouch on the mat between them. "But sometimes the spirits use our losses to prepare us for what we must become." The dog's ears flattened slightly, and he shifted closer to Tahsina. In the firelight, his coat seemed to shimmer with colors that shouldn't have been there: deep blues and purples that reminded her of storm clouds gathering over the mountains. "What is he, grandfather?" White Hawk opened the medicine pouch with reverent care. Inside, nestled in soft deerskin, lay several objects: a piece of black stone carved with symbols, dried herbs that filled the air with their sharp scent, and something that made Tahsina's breath catch, a tuft of fur that matched the dog's coat exactly. "My grandfather's grandfather told stories of the time before the white men came," White Hawk said quietly. "Stories of guardians that walked between the world of spirits and the world of flesh. They appeared when the people faced threats too great for human strength alone." He lifted the carved stone, and Tahsina saw that the symbols were actually tiny figures, humans and animals, moving in patterns that suggested both battle and ceremony. "The last guardian vanished during the long walk, when our people were forced from their homes and marched to the Bosque Redondo. Many thought they were gone forever." The dog made a sound deep in his throat, and White Hawk smiled, the first time Tahsina had seen the old man's face soften since her arrival. "But spirits don't die, child. They wait, they watch, and when the need is great enough, they return." He held up the tuft of fur. "This came from my great-grandfather's medicine bundle. He said it was given to him by a guardian who promised to return when the people faced their greatest trial." Tahsina stared at the fur, then at the dog, whose ancient eyes seemed to hold depths of knowledge and sorrow that made her chest tight. "You're saying I'm saying he's more than what he appears, just as you are more than what you appear." White Hawk carefully returned the objects to the pouch. "The railroad men think they're dealing with a widow and her pet. They have no idea what forces they've awakened." A chill ran down Tahsina's spine. "What forces?" "The land itself fights back, child. When sacred places are threatened, when the bones of the ancestors are disturbed, when promises are broken, the earth remembers, and sometimes it sends help." The dog rose suddenly, his attention focused on something outside. A moment later, Tahsina heard the sound of approaching horses. White Hawk moved to the window, peering through a gap in the hanging blankets. "Government men," he said grimly. "3 of them, riding hard." Tahsina felt her stomach drop. "They followed me here. Perhaps, or perhaps they're making rounds, spreading their poisoned words to anyone who might resist their plans." White Hawk turned back to her, his expression grave. "Either way, you cannot be found here, not with him." "Why not?" "Because they will see what I see, child. They will recognize that this is no ordinary animal, and they will do everything in their power to destroy him before he can fulfill his purpose." The sound of horses grew closer. White Hawk moved quickly despite his age, gathering several items from around the dwelling. "There is a back path through the trees. Follow the creek bed north until you reach the old ceremonial ground. Wait there until sunset, then return home by the mountain route." He pressed something into her hand, a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. "Keep this with you always. When the time comes, you will know what to do with it." Tahsina looked down at the bundle, feeling a strange warmth emanating from whatever lay inside. "Grandfather, I don't understand any of this. I'm just a woman trying to save her home." White Hawk's weathered hand touched her cheek with surprising gentleness. "You are Tahsina Running Bear, daughter of Black Mountain, granddaughter of Storm. Call her great-granddaughter of the woman who spoke with eagles. The blood of warriors and medicine women flows in your veins." His eyes flicked to the dog, who had moved to the doorway. "And now you have a guardian who has waited a lifetime to stand beside you." The horses were in the settlement now. Voices called out, demanding to speak with White Hawk about recent visitors. Tahsina could hear the arrogance in their tone, the assumption that they had the right to interrogate an elder in his own home. "Go," White Hawk whispered urgently. "Trust in what you cannot see, child. Trust in what your heart knows to be true." Tahsina slipped out the back way, the dog padding silently beside her. As they melted into the forest shadows, she heard one of the government men demanding to know if anyone had seen an Apache woman with an unusually large dog. White Hawk's voice carried clearly through the morning air. I am an old man with failing eyes, gentlemen. Old dogs look large to me. Despite everything, Tahsina almost smiled. The old medicine man had been deflecting government questions for decades. These newcomers had no idea what they were up against. She followed the creek bed as instructed, the dog moving like a shadow beside her. The bundle White Hawk had given her seemed to pulse with warmth against her palm, and she found herself thinking about the stories her grandmother had told, tales of spirits that walked among the people, of guardians who appeared in times of great need. When they reached the old ceremonial ground, a circular clearing marked by standing stones worn smooth by centuries of wind and weather, the dog moved to the center and sat down. He remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the eastern horizon, where storm clouds were beginning to gather. Tahsina settled beside him, unwrapping the bundle White Hawk had given her. Inside lay 3 items: a small piece of turquoise carved into the shape of a bear, a braid of sweetgrass, and a single eagle feather that seemed to catch the light despite the gathering clouds. As she held these sacred objects, feeling their weight and significance, the dog turned to look at her. In his ancient eyes, she saw something that made her breath catch: recognition, loyalty, and something else. Something that looked very much like love. Whatever was coming, whatever forces were arrayed against them, she would not face them alone. The storm broke just as Tahsina and the dog reached her cabin that evening. Rain lashed the mountainside in sheets, turning the paths into muddy torrents and reducing visibility to mere yards. She was grateful for the shelter, but more grateful that the weather would keep unwanted visitors away, at least for the night, inside the cabin. She built up the fire and prepared a simple meal while the dog settled in his usual spot. The sacred objects from White Hawk lay on the kitchen table, seeming to glow in the firelight. The turquoise bear felt warm to the touch, and the eagle feather stirred slightly, even though no wind reached it inside the cabin. She was cleaning the supper dishes when someone knocked on her door. The dog was on his feet instantly, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Tahsina dried her hands slowly, her mind racing. No one traveled mountain paths in weather like this unless they had urgent business or unless they'd been waiting nearby for her return. Mrs. Running Bear? The voice was unfamiliar, male, with the careful pronunciation of someone not used to Apache names. I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but I need to speak with you about a legal matter. Tahsina moved to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. A lone rider sat his horse in the driving rain, water streaming from his hat and coat. He looked miserable but determined, the kind of man who followed orders regardless of personal comfort. Legal matters can wait for morning, she called back. I'm afraid this can't wait, ma'am. I'm Deputy Marshal Carson from the Territorial Court. I have papers that need to be served tonight. The dog moved to stand beside her at the window, his massive frame tense with barely controlled energy. When lightning flashed across the sky, it illuminated his face for a moment, and Tahsina caught her breath. His eyes were glowing, not reflecting the lightning but actually producing their own soft blue-white light. Mrs. Running Bear, I know you're in there. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Tahsina made her decision. She opened the door just wide enough to step outside, pulling her shawl tight against the wind and rain. The dog remained inside, though she could feel his presence like a coiled spring, ready to release. Deputy Marshal Carson was younger than his voice had suggested, probably in his 20s, with the kind of earnest face that belonged on a schoolteacher rather than a lawman. His hand rested on the butt of his pistol, but he didn't seem eager to draw it. What papers? She asked without preamble. Carson reached into his coat and withdrew a leather envelope, trying to shield it from the rain. Eviction notice, ma'am. Official order from the Territorial Land Commission. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises. 72 hours. Tahsina's voice was sharp. They said 30 days, just 2 days ago. The deputy looked uncomfortable. There's been a development, ma'am. The railroad company has filed an emergency petition claiming that continued occupation of the property represents a threat to public safety and territorial development. What kind of threat? Carson gestured vaguely toward the cabin. The harboring of dangerous animals, ma'am. There are reports that you're keeping a wolf or wolf hybrid that poses a risk to the community. Thunder rolled across the mountains, and in its wake came another sound, the dog's growl, deep and resonant, carrying clearly through the cabin walls. Carson's horse shied violently, and the deputy had to grab the saddle horn to keep from being thrown. "That's no wolf," Tahsina said quietly. "Ma'am, with respect, I've seen the reports. Whatever that animal is, it's got the whole town spooked. Mayor Collins received 3 complaints just today about people being afraid to let their children play outside." Tahsina felt anger building in her chest like pressure in a kettle. "Has anyone actually been harmed?" "Well, no, ma'am, but has the animal left my property and threatened anyone?" "Not exactly, but the size of the creature, size isn't a crime, Marshal Carson." Tahsina stepped closer, and the young man instinctively backed his horse away. "Fear isn't evidence of wrongdoing." Another flash of lightning illuminated the clearing, and Carson's eyes widened. Through the cabin window, the dog was clearly visible, and in the electric light, he looked enormous, more like a small horse than any breed of dog the deputy had ever seen. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. The law says you have 72 hours to remove yourself and all animals from the property. After that, territorial marshals will be authorized to use force if necessary." He thrust the envelope toward her, and Tahsina took it with hands that didn't quite shake. "Is that a threat, Marshal?" "It's the law, ma'am. I don't make it. I just enforce it." Carson was already turning his horse away, eager to escape the storm and the unsettling presence that seemed to press against him from the cabin. 3 days, Mrs. Running Bear. Don't make this harder on yourself than it has to be." As the deputy disappeared into the rain and darkness, Tahsina stood in her doorway for a long moment, letting the water soak through her shawl. 3 days. They'd cut her time by more than half, using fear and prejudice as weapons, more effective than any gun. She went back inside and opened the envelope with careful fingers. The legal language was dense and intimidating, full of whereas and heretofore and other words designed to confuse and overwhelm. But the meaning was clear enough: leave or be removed by force. The dog padded over to her. His earlier glow faded back to normal brown eyes filled with what looked like concern. She reached out to stroke his massive head, feeling the steady comfort of his presence. "They're afraid of you," she said softly, "but they don't understand what they should really be afraid of." The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having passed through during the night. Tahsina was feeding her chickens when she spotted riders approaching from town. Not officials this time, but neighbors. Sam Morrison led the group, followed by the blacksmith Tom Wheeler and his wife Mary. Old Pete, with his notorious goats, trailing behind, and surprisingly, Mayor Collins himself. The dog emerged from the cabin to take his usual protective position, but something was different. He seemed larger somehow, more substantial, as if the storm had fed something essential in his nature. The visitors' horses began to dance nervously before they were even within 100 yards of the cabin. "Morning, Tahsina," Sam called out as they approached. His voice carried a formality that hadn't been there during his previous visit. "We need to talk." "About what?" Mayor Collins cleared his throat importantly. "Mrs. Running Bear, the town council held an emergency meeting last night. We've received multiple complaints about the dangerous animal you're harboring." "From who?" "That's not important. What matters is that the community has legitimate safety concerns." Tom Wheeler, a big man with arms like tree trunks from years at the forge, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Tahsina, nobody wants to cause you trouble. But that thing you've got, it's not natural. My horses won't come within a quarter mile of this place anymore. Animals sense things," his wife Mary added nervously. "They know when something's wrong." Tahsina looked from face to face, seeing fear and uncertainty in people who'd known her for years. "Has anyone here ever seen this dog behave aggressively? Has he ever threatened any of you or your families?" Silence stretched between them, broken only by the nervous stamping of horses and Pete's goats bleating in the distance. "Well, no," Sam admitted reluctantly. "But the reports we're getting—" "What reports? From who?" Mayor Collins produced a sheaf of papers from his coat. "Railroad representatives, territorial officials, concerned citizens. They all describe an animal of unusual size, displaying threatening behavior. I've never seen these people before in my life. Tahsina's voice was flat. They come here with their papers and their threats, and suddenly my neighbors are afraid of me. The dog took a step forward, and every horse in the group tried to back away, despite their riders' efforts to control them. In the morning sunlight, his coat seemed to shimmer with colors that shouldn't exist in nature. "Mrs. Running Bear," Mayor Collins said. His voice strained as he fought to keep his mount steady. "The territorial government has made it clear that this community's future depends on our cooperation with the railroad development. If we're seen as harboring threats to public safety, threats to railroad profits." "You mean the two aren't mutually exclusive?" Collins's political instincts were clearly warring with his discomfort. "Look, the town council is prepared to offer assistance in relocating. We could help you find suitable property elsewhere, maybe even some financial support. This is my home. Mrs. Running Bear, please be reasonable. The territorial government has resources we can't match. If you force a confrontation, you'll lose everything." Tahsina looked at each face in turn, seeing the mixture of fear and guilt and helpless frustration. These were good people mostly, caught between their loyalty to a neighbor and their fear of forces beyond their control. "I understand your position," she said finally, "but I won't abandon my home because strangers find my dog inconvenient." She turned and walked toward the cabin, the dog falling into step beside her. Behind them, she heard Mayor Collins calling out one last appeal. "You have until tomorrow night. Mrs. Running Bear. After that, it's out of our hands." Inside the cabin, Tahsina sat at her kitchen table and stared at the eviction notice. 72 hours had become less than 48. The net was tightening, and she could feel the weight of forces far greater than herself pressing down from all sides. The dog settled beside her chair, his massive head resting on her knee. When she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her breath catch: understanding, determination. And beneath it all, a flicker of something that might have been anticipation. "What are you waiting for, old friend?" she whispered. The dog lifted his head toward the window, where sunlight streamed across the meadow where Joseph lay buried. In the distance, she could hear the sound of hammering. Railroad crews, perhaps, or surveyors marking boundaries for the destruction to come. Whatever was going to happen, it would happen soon. That night, Tahsina dreamed of her grandmother. She stood in a place that was both the ceremonial ground and somewhere else entirely. A vast plain, where buffalo grazed beneath stars that pulsed with their own heartbeat. Her grandmother appeared as she had in life, small but fierce, with silver hair braided down her back and eyes that missed nothing. "Child," the old woman said, her voice carrying the whisper of wind through sage-grass, "you have forgotten who you are." "Grandmother, I don't understand what's happening. They want to take everything, and I don't know how to fight them, the same way your people have always fought. With wisdom, with courage, with the knowledge that some things are worth more than life itself." Her grandmother gestured toward the horizon, where something massive moved in the starlight. "Your guardian knows this, do you?" Tahsina tried to see what moved in the distance, but the dream shifted and changed like smoke. "White Hawk says he's a spirit, but I still don't understand. Understanding comes from the heart, not the mind. You feel his truth, even if you cannot name it." Her grandmother stepped closer, and Tahsina caught the familiar scent of wood smoke and sage. "The stone will show you when you are ready to see." What stone? But her grandmother was already fading, dissolving back into starlight and memory. "Trust what your blood knows, child. Trust what your heart believes. And remember, the land remembers everything." Tahsina woke to find the dog standing at the window, his massive frame silhouetted against the pre-dawn darkness. He was perfectly still, but every line of his body spoke of alertness. She could hear what had wakened him, the sound of horses moving carefully up the mountain path, trying to approach without being detected. She dressed quickly and quietly, slipping White Hawk's sacred objects into her pockets. The turquoise bear felt almost warm against her palm, and the eagle feather seemed to stir with its own life. Whatever was coming, she would meet it prepared. The dog moved away from the window and padded to the back of the cabin, where he began to scratch at a loose floorboard beneath Joseph's old chair. Tahsina knelt beside him, prying up the board with her fingers. Hidden beneath lay something she'd forgotten, a wooden box containing Joseph's most precious possessions. Inside, wrapped in soft deerskin, lay a stone unlike any she'd ever seen. It was perfectly black, shot through with veins of silver that seemed to move in the lamplight. As her fingers closed around it, the stone grew warm and began to pulse with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Suddenly, the world changed. She could see through the cabin walls as if they were made of water. Outside, 6 men moved through the trees with the careful precision of hunters. They carried rifles and wore the kind of clothes that marked them as hired guns rather than legitimate lawmen. These weren't territorial marshals. They were railroad thugs sent to solve a problem that legal channels couldn't handle quickly enough. But more than that, she could see the dog as he truly was. Light poured from him like captured starfire, and his form seemed to shift between the massive canine she knew and something far older and more magnificent. In the stone's vision, he appeared as her ancestors might have seen him, a guardian spirit wearing flesh like a borrowed coat. Ancient beyond measure and patient as the mountains themselves, the vision faded, leaving her gasping and shaken. The dog looked at her with knowing eyes, and she understood that he'd been waiting for this moment, for her to see past the illusion of the ordinary world into the deeper truths beneath. Outside, the hired guns were spreading out to surround the cabin. She heard the soft clink of metal on stone as they found their positions, the whispered communications of men who'd done this kind of work before. "We know you're in there," a voice called from the darkness. "Come out peaceful-like and nobody gets hurt." Tahsina moved to the window and peered through the curtains. In the pre-dawn gloom, she could make out the shapes of armed men positioned around her home, like wolves circling wounded prey. These weren't the kind of men who kept their word about not hurting anyone. "You have no authority here," she called back, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "We've got all the authority we need, lady. Railroad company hired us to clear out squatters and dangerous animals. You can make this easy or hard, but either way you're leaving." The dog moved to stand beside her, and she felt the familiar comfort of his presence. But now, with the vision from the stone still fresh in her memory, she understood that comfort came from something far more powerful than she'd imagined. "Last chance," the voice called. "Come out now, or we come in shooting." Tahsina looked down at the sacred stone in her palm, feeling its warmth pulse against her skin. Her grandmother's words echoed in her memory. "Trust what your blood knows, trust what your heart believes." "I'm not leaving," she called back, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "This is my home and I'll defend it." Silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then she heard the sharp crack of a rifle shot, and wood splintered from the cabin wall near her head. "Next one won't miss," the voice warned. "Come out now." Instead, Tahsina stepped back from the window and looked at the dog. He was watching her with those ancient eyes, and she could see in them a question that needed answering. Was she ready to accept what he truly was? Was she ready to become what this moment demanded? She thought of Joseph, buried in the meadow they wanted to destroy. She thought of her grandmother's stories, of guardians who appeared when the need was great. She thought of White Hawk's words about spirits that waited and watched and returned when their people faced their greatest trials. "I'm ready," she whispered. The dog's form seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising from Summerstone. For a moment she saw him as the vision had shown her, magnificent and terrible, wreathed in starlight and power. Then he settled back into his familiar shape, but the air around him hummed with barely contained energy. Another rifle shot shattered the morning quiet, this time aimed at the door. Wood chips flew as the heavy bullet punched through the thick planks. "That's enough talking," the gunman called. "Boys, burn them out." Through the window, Tahsina saw one of the men producing a torch from his saddlebags, while another uncapped what looked like a bottle of lamp oil. They meant to fire the cabin with her inside it, claiming later that she'd died resisting legal eviction. The dog padded to the door and looked back at her expectantly. His meaning was clear. It was time to stop hiding, time to face what was coming with the full truth of what they both were. Tahsina gripped the sacred stone tightly and walked to the door. As her hand touched the latch, she felt power flow through her like lightning through a copper wire. The stone in her palm blazed with silver light, and suddenly she could feel the land itself beneath her feet, every rock and tree and blade of grass connected to her awareness like nerves in a vast living body. She opened the door and stepped outside, the dog moving to stand at her left side. The hired guns tensed, raising their rifles, but something in her posture made them hesitate. "I am Tahsina Running Bear," she said, her voice carrying farther than it should have in the morning air. "Daughter of Black Mountain, granddaughter of Stormcaller, great-granddaughter of she who speaks with eagles. This land is sacred to my people. The bones of our ancestors rest in this soil. And you," she pointed directly at the man with the torch, "will not defile it." The gunman laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the mountain walls. "Lady, I don't care if you're the queen of the Indians. You've got 2 minutes to clear out before we burn this place to the ground." He stepped forward with the torch raised, and that's when everything changed. The dog moved. He didn't run or charge or attack in any conventional sense. Instead, he simply expanded, his form growing larger and more luminous with each step until he stood 8 feet tall at the shoulder, his coat blazing with silver fire that turned the pre-dawn darkness bright as day. The horses screamed. Every mount the gunman had brought reared and bolted, carrying their riders' supplies and escape routes with them into the forest. The men themselves stumbled backward, their rifles suddenly seeming as insignificant as children's toys in the face of something that belonged to an older, deeper world than theirs. "What in the hell?" the leader began. But his words died as the dog, the guardian, turned those ancient, blazing eyes on him. When the spirit spoke, its voice came from everywhere at once. The wind in the trees, the stones beneath their feet, the very air itself. "This land is protected. These people are protected. Leave now and carry word back to those who sent you. There are forces in this territory older and stronger than your railroads and your greed. Do not return." The man with the torch dropped it, the flame guttering out in the morning dew. His hand shook as he tried to raise his rifle, but the weapon felt impossibly heavy in his grip. "You're all dead men," he managed to gasp. "The railroad company. They've got resources you can't imagine, and I have patience they cannot fathom." The guardian's form pulsed with starlight. "I have walked this land since before your people dreamed of crossing the great water. I will walk it long after your railroads have rusted away to nothing." The gunmen broke and ran, crashing through the underbrush in their haste to escape something their minds couldn't fully comprehend. Their panicked shouts faded into the distance, leaving only the normal sounds of morning, birds calling from the trees, the whisper of wind through pine needles. The guardian's blazing form gradually dimmed, settling back into the familiar shape of the massive dog. But now Tahsina could see the truth that had always been there. The ancient intelligence, the patient power, the deep connection to forces that predated human civilization. "They'll be back," she said quietly. The dog looked at her with eyes that held the wisdom of centuries. In them, she read a simple truth: let them come. Word of the failed raid spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire, but like all stories passed from mouth to mouth, it grew stranger and more distorted with each telling. By noon, the versions being whispered in the saloon bore little resemblance to what had actually happened on Tahsina's mountain. Some said she'd summoned demons from Apache hell to protect her property. Others claimed she was a witch who could turn men into animals with a glance. The most persistent rumor was that she kept a monster that could grow to the size of a house and breathe fire like a dragon. Samuel Morrison heard 3 different versions before he'd finished his morning coffee, each more fantastical than the last. By the time Mayor Collins called an emergency town meeting that afternoon, the entire community was buzzing with fear and wild speculation. Tahsina knew none of this, as she spent the morning reinforcing her defenses and trying to process what she'd witnessed. The sacred stone had revealed truths that challenged everything she thought she understood about the world. But it had also filled her with a deep sense of purpose she hadn't felt since Joseph's death. The guardian, she found herself thinking of him that way now, had returned to his usual calm demeanor, though she occasionally caught glimpses of something deeper when the light hit his eyes just right. He seemed content to let her work through the implications of what had been revealed while he kept watch. For any new threats, she was mending the bullet holes in her cabin wall when the first wave of refugees arrived. They came in ones and twos at first, Apache families from the reservation, walking the mountain paths with bundles on their backs and fear in their eyes. Word had reached them about the morning's confrontation, and they were seeking shelter with the woman who had stood against the white man's guns and won. By evening, nearly 20 people had gathered in her clearing, setting up temporary camps and sharing what food they'd brought. Tahsina found herself at the center of something she'd never expected, a rallying point for resistance against forces that seemed unstoppable. "They came to the reservation this morning," explained Maria Crowfeather, a woman Tahsina's age, whose husband had died in a mining accident the previous winter. Government men with papers saying the boundaries needed to be adjusted for territorial development. "They want to move everyone to smaller parcels farther north, smaller and less fertile," added Tom Big Bear, an elder whose weathered face showed the marks of decades fighting losing battles. "Land that won't support families won't grow crops. They want us to starve quietly while they build their railroad empire." Tahsina listened to their stories while the guardian moved among the gathered families like a gentle giant, somehow managing to project both power and peace. Children who should have been terrified by his size instead seemed drawn to him, and she watched in amazement as a little girl named Rose actually fell asleep against his massive flank. "What do we do?" Maria asked, echoing the question on everyone's mind. "How do we fight something this big?" Before Tahsina could answer, the sound of many horses approaching cut through the evening air. The guardian was on his feet instantly, positioning himself between the refugees and the approaching riders. But as the group emerged from the trees, Tahsina realized these weren't more railroad thugs. Mayor Collins led a delegation of townspeople up the mountain path, but his usual political confidence had been replaced by obvious nervousness. Behind him rode Sam Morrison, Tom Wheeler, and a dozen other residents of Cedar Ridge, some of them carrying lanterns, others with rifles across their saddles. "Mrs. Running Bear," the mayor called out as they approached the edge of the clearing. "We need to talk." "Then talk," Tahsina replied, not moving from her position near the campfire where the Apache families had gathered. Collins dismounted but stayed close to his horse, clearly uncomfortable with the scene before him. "These people need to return to the reservation immediately. Harboring fugitives is a federal crime." "What makes them fugitives?" Tahsina asked. "They left their assigned lands without permission. Under territorial law, that constitutes illegal movement of Indian populations." Tom Big Bear spat into the fire, making it hiss. "We're seeking protection from illegal seizure of our homes. Where in your white man's law does it say we can't do that?" Mayor Collins shifted nervously as the guardian moved closer, his massive form clearly visible in the firelight. "The point is, this situation has gotten out of hand. We've had reports of violence, of dangerous animals threatening citizens." "What citizens?" Tahsina interrupted. "The hired guns who came to burn down my cabin? Are they the ones filing complaints?" "The railroad company has filed formal charges with the territorial government," Collins replied stiffly. "They claim their lawful representatives were attacked by something that defies natural explanation." Sam Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Tahsina, we've all heard the stories. What really happened here this morning?" She looked around at the faces in the firelight, her own people seeking protection, townspeople torn between fear and curiosity, the guardian watching everything with those ancient, knowing eyes. How could she explain what she'd seen without sounding like the wild rumors already circulating? "Men with guns came to force me from my home," she said simply. They threatened to burn my cabin with me inside it. My dog convinced them to leave. Your dog, Collins repeated, his voice flat with disbelief. My dog. Tom Wheeler leaned forward in his saddle. Tahsina, I've been shoeing horses for 30 years. I know animals. That thing you've got, it's not like anything I've ever seen. Different doesn't mean dangerous, Tom. But it could, Collins interjected. The territorial government is sending a full investigation team. Federal marshals, territorial rangers, maybe even army troops. They're calling it a threat to public safety and territorial development. A chill ran through the gathered Apache families. Federal intervention had never ended well for their people. The Guardian seemed to sense the shift in mood, moving closer to the fire, where his presence provided both comfort and silent warning. When? Tahsina asked. 3 days, maybe 4. They're assembling a force large enough to handle any resistance. Collins looked directly at her. They're not coming to negotiate, Mrs. Running Bear. They're coming to end this situation permanently. Maria Crowfeather stood up slowly, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. And what does the town of Cedar Ridge intend to do when they arrive? The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Collins glanced at his companions, seeing uncertainty and division in their faces. Some of the townspeople looked ashamed, others defiant, most simply confused and frightened. The town council has voted to cooperate fully with territorial authorities, Collins said finally. We can't afford to be seen as harboring resistance to federal law, even when that law is unjust. Tom Big Bear asked. Justice isn't my decision to make. I have to think about the welfare of all the citizens of Cedar Ridge. Old Pete, his white hair wild in the firelight, suddenly spoke up from the back of the group. What about the welfare of folks who've been here longer than any of us? Apache family's been in these mountains for generations before the first white man ever saw this valley. Mr. Peterson. Please, no, I won't please. Pete urged his horse forward, his voice rising with unexpected passion. I've been living in these mountains for 40 years, and I never seen Apache folks cause trouble for anybody. But I've seen plenty of government men and railroad thugs cause trouble for everybody. A murmur of agreement ran through some of the townspeople, and Tahsina realized that the community was more divided than Collins wanted to admit. Fear was warring with conscience, and the outcome was far from certain. The federal government has resources we can't match, Collins insisted. If we're seen as supporting resistance to territorial law, they could revoke our charter, cut off federal support, even relocate the entire settlement. And if we stand by while they destroy everything decent about this place, Sam Morrison said quietly, what's left worth saving? The question silenced everyone for a moment. In the flickering firelight, Tahsina could see the conflict, playing out on individual faces, the struggle between practical fear and moral conviction that had faced decent people throughout history. The Guardian rose to his feet and padded to the edge of the fire's circle, where he stood looking out into the darkness. His posture spoke of alert attention, as if he sensed something approaching that the humans couldn't yet detect. They're coming tonight, Tom Big Bear said suddenly, reading the same signs in the Guardian's behavior. Not the federal troops, someone else. As if summoned by his words, the sound of many horses echoed from the valley below. But these weren't the careful, stealthy movements of earlier that morning. This was the thunder of armed men riding hard, making no attempt at concealment. Mayor Collins paled in the firelight. I told them this was a peaceful gathering. Who did you tell? Tahsina demanded. The railroad representatives. They insisted on being informed of any developments. His words were cut off by the crack of rifle fire from the valley below. Not aimed shots, but the kind of shooting meant to intimidate and scatter. The Apache families began gathering their children, and several of the townspeople reached for their own weapons. The Guardian's form began to shimmer in the firelight, and Tahsina felt the sacred stone in her pocket grow warm. Whatever was coming up that mountain path, it was going to find more than a few refugees and a scared town council. It was going to find a people who had finally remembered how to fight back. The riders came fast and hard up the mountain path, their torches blazing like angry stars in the darkness. But as they reached the clearing, Tahsina realized these weren't the railroad thugs she'd expected. These men wore the clean uniforms of territorial marshals, led by a figure she recognized from wanted posters in the general store, Commissioner Hughes himself, flanked by a dozen armed deputies. "By order of the territorial government," Hughes called out, as his men spread into a loose semicircle around the clearing. "This illegal assembly is hereby disbanded. All persons present will surrender their weapons and submit to detention for questioning." The Guardian moved to stand directly in front of the fire, his massive form casting shifting shadows across the assembled crowd. In the torchlight, he looked even larger than usual, and several of the deputies' horses began to shy nervously away. "On what authority?" Tahsina demanded, stepping forward. Hughes dismounted and withdrew a thick sheaf of papers from his saddlebags. "Federal warrant for the arrest of Tahsina Running Bear on charges of harboring dangerous animals, inciting rebellion among Indian populations, and conspiracy against territorial development." Conspiracy? Sam Morrison's voice was sharp with disbelief. "What conspiracy?" "The conspiracy to obstruct lawful railroad construction through the use of violence and supernatural intimidation." Hughes's voice carried the pompous certainty of a man who'd never been seriously challenged. "We have testimony from multiple witnesses describing attacks by an unnatural creature under this woman's control." Mayor Collins shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Commissioner, with respect, the town council wasn't informed that federal charges were being filed. The town council has no jurisdiction over federal matters." "Mayor, your cooperation is appreciated but not required." Hughes gestured to his men, who began to advance with their rifles raised. "Mrs. Running Bear, you will surrender yourself and the animal for immediate transport to territorial custody." That's when Tom Big Bear stepped forward, his weathered face grim in the firelight. "I don't think you understand what you're dealing with here, government man." Hughes barely glanced at him. "Stand aside, old man. This doesn't concern you. Everything about this land concerns me. My people walked these mountains before your grandfathers were born." Tom's voice carried the weight of generations. "And that creature you want to take, he's been here longer than all of us." "Superstitious nonsense," Hughes snapped. "It's an animal, nothing more. A large dog or wolf hybrid that will be properly contained and studied." The Guardian's ears flattened against his massive head, and a sound emerged from his throat that made every horse in the clearing begin to back away, despite their riders' efforts to control them. It wasn't quite a growl, it was deeper than that, more fundamental, like the rumble of an earthquake before the ground splits open. "Sir," one of the deputies called out, his voice tight with fear, "maybe we should wait for backup." "We have all the backup we need," Hughes cut him off. But even as he spoke, Tahsina noticed how his hand trembled slightly as he reached into his coat. What he withdrew made her blood run cold. Not another legal document, but a leather portfolio bearing the seal of the Colorado and Pacific Railroad Company. "What is that?" she demanded. Hughes smiled, and for the first time she saw the true calculation behind his officious manner. "The real reason we're here, Mrs. Running Bear, not some territorial land dispute or public safety concern. This." He opened the portfolio and withdrew a geological survey map covered in red marks and technical notations. "Gold." Sam Morrison breathed, reading the survey markers. "Better than gold." Hughes held the map up so everyone could see it in the torchlight. "Coal. More coal than has ever been found in a single location west of the Mississippi. Enough to power railroad expansion across the entire territory for the next century." Tahsina felt the world shift beneath her feet. "You're saying—" "I'm saying this entire valley sits on top of the largest coal deposit in the Western Territories. And your little property, Mrs. Running Bear, happens to be located at the exact center of the richest vein." Hughes's mask of official propriety finally dropped, revealing the greed beneath. "The railroad company has been planning this operation for 2 years. Every land grab, every boundary dispute, every legal challenge, all of it designed to clear the valley for mining operations." Mayor Collins' face had gone pale. You lied to us. All those promises about railroad development, about bringing prosperity to Cedar Ridge. Oh, there will be development, Mayor. Strip mining operations that will employ hundreds of workers. Company towns to house them. Processing facilities to ship the coal east. Hughes gestured broadly at the mountains around them. This entire valley will be transformed into the most productive mining operation in the territory. And everyone who lives here now? Maria Crowfeather asked quietly. Will be relocated to more suitable accommodations, of course. The company is prepared to offer generous compensation for any inconvenience. Tom Big Bear spat into the fire again, making it hiss like an angry snake. Generous compensation for the destruction of our sacred lands, for the desecration of burial grounds that have been protected for centuries. Sacred lands don't generate tax revenue, old man. Coal does. Hughes turned his attention back to Tahsina. The company tried to handle this quietly, through legal channels, but you've forced their hand with your resistance. Now they're prepared to take more direct action. As if summoned by his words, the sound of more horses echoed from multiple directions around the clearing. Tahsina realized with growing horror that the territorial marshals weren't the main force. They were just the distraction. The real threat was surrounding them from all sides. You see, Mrs. Running Bear, the company has hired some very experienced problem solvers, men who specialize in clearing obstacles to legitimate business development. Hughes smiled again, and this time there was nothing but cold calculation in his expression. Men who don't particularly care whether those obstacles are legal or supernatural. The Guardian's form began to shimmer in the firelight, and Tahsina felt the sacred stone in her pocket grow burning hot. But something was wrong. The power that had flowed so freely that morning felt constrained, muffled, as if something was blocking it. You're wondering why your Guardian seems weakened, Hughes observed with satisfaction. The company employs some very knowledgeable consultants, men who understand that certain old powers can be contained with the right preparations. From his saddlebags, he withdrew an object that made several of the Apache elders gasp in recognition and horror. It was a medicine bundle, but one that had been corrupted. Black feathers bound with wire instead of sinew, symbols carved into human bone rather than sacred stone. Dark medicine, Tom Big Bear whispered. They've hired a witch. They've hired someone who understands that old superstitions can be turned against themselves. Hughes corrected. Your guardian spirit is powerful, but power has rules, and rules can be broken by those who know them well enough. The Guardian tried to step forward, but his movements seemed sluggish, as if he were moving through thick mud. The light that usually surrounded him flickered and dimmed, and Tahsina could feel his distress like a physical pain in her chest. Release him, she demanded, her voice shaking with rage. I'm afraid that's not possible. The company has invested too much in this operation to let a local legend interfere with progress. Hughes mounted his horse again, his territorial martial act completely abandoned now. But I am authorized to make you one final offer. Surrender yourself and the creature peacefully, and the Apache families will be allowed to relocate without harassment. Resist, and everyone in this clearing will be considered a threat to territorial security. The meaning was clear. Surrender, or watch innocent people die. Tahsina looked around at the faces of her people, at the children huddled against their mothers, at the townspeople who'd come here seeking answers and found themselves trapped in something far larger and more dangerous than they'd imagined. How long? She asked quietly. How long what? How long have you been planning this? How long have you known about the coal? Hughes consulted a pocket watch with elaborate satisfaction. The initial geological surveys were completed 18 months ago. The legal framework for land acquisition was established 9 months ago, and the specific plan to neutralize local resistance has been in development for 6 months. 6 months. Tahsina felt something cold settle in her stomach as the implications became clear. The auction. The dog, he wasn't there by accident. Very good, Mrs. Running Bear. No, he wasn't there by accident. The company's consultants identified him as a potential threat years ago. a creature of power that might rally resistance to their operations. So they arranged for him to be captured and placed where they could monitor his activities. But he chose me. He chose exactly who they expected him to choose. A widow with ties to both the Apache community and the white settlers. Someone who could serve as a focal point for resistance that could then be systematically eliminated. Hughes's smile was triumphant. You've been playing their game from the beginning, Mrs. Running Bear. Every move you've made has been anticipated and planned for. The words hit her like physical blows. Everything she'd thought was fate or destiny had been manipulation. The connection she'd felt with the Guardian, the growing sense of purpose, the gathering of her people around a symbol of hope, all of it had been orchestrated by forces she'd never even known existed. But as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she felt something stir in the depths of her awareness. The sacred stone in her pocket was still warm, and when she touched it, she heard her grandmother's voice as clearly as if the old woman stood beside her. The land remembers everything, child, even the lies they tell themselves. The land remembers. Tahsina looked at the corrupted medicine bundle in Hughes's hands, at the Guardian struggling against forces that constrained his ancient power, at the faces of her people trapped between hope and terror. And suddenly she understood what her grandmother had been trying to tell her. They could bind a spirit, corrupt sacred objects, and manipulate events through careful planning. But they couldn't change the fundamental truth of what this land was, what it meant, and what it would do to protect itself. You made one mistake, she said quietly, stepping toward Hughes despite the rifles trained on her. And what mistake was that? You assumed the Guardian was the only power here worth worrying about. The sacred stone blazed to life in her pocket, its light shining through the fabric of her dress. But this time, the power didn't flow just from the Guardian. It flowed from the land itself, from every tree and stone and blade of grass, from the bones of ancestors buried in sacred ground, from the very mountains that had watched over this valley since, before human memory began. Hughes's corrupted medicine bundle began to smoke and char in his hands as power older and deeper than his hired witch had ever imagined awakened to defend. What was sacred? The real battle was about to begin. The corrupted medicine bundle burst into flames in Hughes's hands, forcing him to drop it with a curse. As the dark object hit the ground, the sacred fire spread outward in a circle that made his horse rear and prance with terror. The Guardian shook himself as if waking from a dream, his movements suddenly fluid and powerful once again. Fall back, Hughes shouted to his men, but the sacred fire was already spreading, not burning the grass or trees, but illuminating them with silver light that seemed to come from within. Fall back to defensive positions. The territorial marshals tried to retreat, but their horses had other ideas. Every mount in the clearing was now bucking and shying, responding to forces their riders couldn't understand. Several deputies were thrown from their saddles, and others clung desperately to animals that wanted nothing more than to flee this place where the very ground had awakened. Tahsina felt the change like electricity in her bones. The sacred stone in her pocket had become almost too hot to touch, but she gripped it anyway, letting its power flow through her into the earth beneath her feet. She could feel the mountains themselves stirring, centuries of patient watching giving way to active protection. Tom, she called to the Apache elder, gather the families. Get them to the ceremonial ground. The old stones will protect them. Big Bear nodded grimly and began organizing the rapid evacuation of the non-combatants. But as the Apache families began to move, armed figures emerged from the forest around the clearing. These weren't territorial marshals. They were the mercenaries Hughes had mentioned, dressed in dark clothing and carrying weapons that spoke of serious military experience. "Surround them," the lead mercenary called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "No one leaves this clearing." Mayor Collins, still mounted and caught between the two forces, raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Now wait just a minute, we're all citizens here. You have no authority to—" The mercenary's rifle swung toward him. You lost the right to negotiate when you chose to harbor enemies of territorial development. Mayor Collins, you and your people can ride out of here right now, or you can share the fate of the others. Several of the townspeople began to edge their horses toward the forest, clearly tempted by the offer of safe passage. But Sam Morrison spurred his mount forward instead, positioning himself between the mercenaries and the Apache families. "I've known these folks for 20 years, he said firmly. "They're not enemies of anything except greed and corruption." Tom Wheeler moved up beside him, his massive frame imposing even on horseback. "Sam's right. We came here for answers, and now we've got them. Question is, what are we going to do about it?" The Guardian padded to the center of the clearing, his form beginning to glow with renewed power. As the silver light grew stronger, the mercenaries' weapons began to feel heavy in their hands, and their night vision equipment started to malfunction. "Sir," one of the hired guns called to his leader, "the gear's not working right. Something's interfering with the electronics." "Ancient spirits don't care about your technology," Tom Big Bear said with grim satisfaction as he helped Maria Crow Feather gather the children. "They've been protecting this land since before your people learned to make fire." Hughes, now dismounted and clearly struggling to maintain control of the situation, pulled out a military radio. "All units, this is command. Initiate Phase 2 immediately. Full containment protocols." The radio crackled with static, then responded with a voice that made Tahsina's blood run cold. "Phase 2 confirmed, command. Heavy weapons teams in position. ETA 2 minutes, heavy weapons." They weren't just planning to arrest her and the Guardian. They were planning to destroy the entire mountainside, if necessary. "You're insane," Mayor Collins breathed. "There are innocent families here, children. There are obstacles to legitimate business development," Hughes corrected coldly. "The company has invested too much to let sentiment interfere with necessary operations." The Guardian raised his massive head toward the sky and released a howl that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth itself. The sound echoed off the mountain walls, growing louder and more complex with each repetition until it became something almost like music, wild, ancient, and filled with power that made the trees themselves seem to lean in and listen. "What is he doing?" one of the mercenaries asked nervously. Tahsina smiled, understanding finally dawning. "He's calling them." "Calling who?" Her answer came from the forest around them, howls responding to the Guardian's call, but not from wolves or dogs. These voices belonged to something else entirely, something that had been waiting in the deep places of the mountains for generations. The first spirit appeared at the edge of the clearing, taking the form of a massive elk whose antlers seemed to be made of living starlight. Then came others, a bear that moved like flowing shadow, an eagle whose wingspan blocked out the stars, a mountain cat whose eyes burned like golden flames. The guardian spirits of the mountains were answering the call. Hughes's radio crackled again. "Command, we're seeing some kind of anomalous activity on the thermal scopes. Multiple large signatures moving toward your position." "Just animals," Hughes snapped into the radio. "Proceed with Phase 2. But even as he spoke, his voice shook with uncertainty. These weren't just animals, and everyone in the clearing knew it. The spirits moved with purpose and intelligence, positioning themselves around the perimeter like soldiers taking defensive positions. "This is your last chance," Tahsina called out to the mercenaries, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Leave now and you'll be allowed to go. Stay and face the consequences of your choices." The lead mercenary laughed harshly. "Lady, I don't care what kind of light show you've got going. We've got orders, and we intend to carry them out." That's when the mountain itself decided to participate in the conversation. The ground beneath their feet began to shake, not the random tremor of an earthquake, but a rhythmic pulse that matched the beating of a vast heart. Trees that had stood for centuries began to sway without wind, and rocks that had been stable for millennia started to shift and resettle. "Command!" the radio crackled frantically. "The entire mountain is showing seismic activity. Recommend immediate evacuation." Hughes smashed the radio against a tree, cutting off the transmission. We're not retreating from a few parlor tricks and some trained animals. Set up defensive positions and wait for heavy weapons support. But his men were already starting to break. Facing supernatural forces was one thing when you were getting paid well for it, but facing an entire mountainside that had apparently come alive was something else entirely. Several of the mercenaries were backing toward the forest, their weapons lowered and their eyes wide with fear. The Guardian moved to stand beside Tahsina, his massive form radiating power that made the air itself seem to shimmer. Round the clearing, the other spirits held their positions, watching and waiting for some signal that would unleash forces these men had never imagined. "You still don't understand," Tahsina said, her voice carrying the authority of generations. "This isn't about land rights or railroad development or even coal deposits. This is about sacred places that have been protected for longer than your civilization has existed." She reached into her pocket and withdrew the sacred stone, holding it up so its silver light blazed across the clearing. In that light, the spirits became fully visible, magnificent, terrible, and ancient beyond measure. "This is about powers your people forgot existed, but that we have never forgotten. Powers that are bound to this land by ties stronger than any law you can write or any force you can bring to bear." The seismic activity was intensifying now, and several trees around the clearing began to glow with the same silver light that emanated from the stone. The very landscape was awakening, revealing the truth that had always been hidden beneath the surface of the ordinary world. "You wanted to strip mine this valley," Tahsina continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You wanted to tear apart burial grounds and sacred sites for profit. But you made one crucial mistake. You assumed the land would submit quietly to your plans." Hughes raised his pistol with shaking hands. "Enough of this supernatural nonsense. You're under arrest for—" His words were cut off by the sound of helicopters approaching from multiple directions. But as the aircraft came into view, their pilots' voices could be heard over the radio chatter of the mercenaries still in contact with their base. "Command, we're seeing massive electromagnetic interference. Instruments are failing. Recommend abort one of the helicopters. Its navigation systems completely overwhelmed by the spiritual energy radiating from the clearing. Veered off course and had to make an emergency landing in the valley below." The others circled helplessly, unable to get a clear reading on their target through the interference. "Sir," the lead mercenary called to Hughes, "we need to pull back. This is beyond our mission parameters." But Hughes had passed the point of rational decision-making. The revelation of the coal deposits, the months of planning, the company's investment, all of it was slipping away because of forces he couldn't control or understand. "No retreat," he snarled. "Kill them all. Kill everything in this clearing." The mercenaries raised their weapons reluctantly, but before they could fire, the Guardian stepped forward. His form began to expand again, growing larger and more luminous until he stood nearly 10 feet tall, his coat blazing with starfire and his eyes holding the accumulated wisdom of centuries. When he spoke, his voice came from the mountain itself. "You have been warned. You have been offered mercy. Now face the consequences of your choice." The real battle was about to begin, not just between people with different views of progress and tradition, but between the old powers of the earth and the modern forces that sought to dominate them. And in that moment, Tahsina understood that the outcome would determine far more than the fate of one small valley. It would determine whether the sacred places of the world would survive into the new century, or whether they would all fall before the relentless advance of those who saw only profit where others saw the divine. The mercenaries opened fire, their muzzle flashes lighting the clearing like deadly fireworks. But their bullets seemed to slow as they entered the sphere of silver light around the Guardian, tumbling harmlessly to the ground like spent raindrops. The Spirit Guardians responded with movements that belonged more to dream than reality. The great elk charged through the mercenary line, his starlight antlers leaving trails of light that temporarily blinded anyone who looked directly at them. Hughes screamed orders that his men could no longer hear over the sound of the mountain itself awakening. Trees groaned and swayed as root systems that had been dormant for decades suddenly came alive, reaching through the soil to entangle weapons and equipment. The ground beneath the mercenaries' feet became unreliable, shifting and moving like the deck of a ship in heavy seas. Tahsina felt the sacred stone burning in her hand as power flowed through her from sources she was only beginning to understand. The eagle spirit soared overhead, its wings creating winds that scattered the remaining helicopters like leaves before a storm. She could see the pilots struggling with controls that no longer responded to human touch. Their instruments, overwhelmed by forces that belonged to a world older than technology, fall back to secondary positions. The lead mercenary shouted, but his men were already breaking ranks. Fighting human enemies was one thing. Fighting the living spirit of the land itself was something no amount of training had prepared them for. The bear spirit moved through their ranks like flowing shadow, not harming the fleeing men, but ensuring they continued to flee. Its presence carried the weight of every winter these mountains had endured, every storm they had weathered, every generation of life they had sheltered and protected. Mayor Collins and the remaining townspeople had managed to position their horses at the edge of the clearing, caught between their desire to flee and their fascination with witnessing something that would change their understanding of the world forever. Sam Morrison's voice carried clearly through the chaos. "Tom, get those families to safety. This is going to get worse before it gets better." But Tom Big Bear wasn't retreating. Instead, he had begun to sing, an ancient Apache war song that his grandfather had taught him, words in the old language that seemed to give the spiritual forces around them even greater strength and focus. The other Apache elders joined their voices to his, creating a harmony that made the very air shimmer with power. The Guardian, now blazing like a captured star, moved toward Hughes with deliberate, inexorable steps. The corrupt commissioner had drawn his pistol, but his hands shook so badly he could barely aim. Behind him, his remaining deputies were trying to retreat, but found their path blocked by the mountain cat spirit, whose golden eyes held promises of swift justice for those who threatened sacred places. "This is impossible," Hughes gasped, backing away until his shoulders hit the trunk of an ancient pine. "You're just people, just Indians and settlers. You can't stand against the territorial government. You can't fight progress itself." The Guardian paused just outside arm's reach, his massive head tilted slightly as if considering Hughes's words. When he spoke, his voice carried the patience of stone and the inexorability of flowing water. "Progress that destroys what is sacred is not progress. It is merely destruction with a prettier name." From the valley below came the sound of more vehicles approaching, trucks and heavy equipment that the company had positioned as backup. But as they tried to navigate the mountain roads, they found their way blocked by rock slides that seemed to appear spontaneously, and by trees that had fallen across the paths with suspicious timing. The land itself was defending its sacred places. Hughes raised his pistol with both hands, trying to steady his aim. "I don't care what you are. Orders are orders, and I have a job to do." The Guardian's response was not violence, but revelation. His form expanded one final time, becoming translucent and luminous, allowing everyone in the clearing to see through his physical appearance to the truth beneath. What they saw was not a dog or even a wolf, but something far older. A presence that had walked these mountains since before humans had names for the spirits that inhabited wild places. In that moment of revelation, Hughes's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot rang out across the clearing, echoing off the mountain walls like thunder. But the bullet passed harmlessly through the Guardian's luminous form, striking the pine tree behind him and sending bark flying. The Guardian looked down at Hughes with something that might have been pity. "You cannot kill what was never truly alive in the way you understand life. You cannot destroy what exists beyond your definitions of reality." That's when the real power of the mountain made itself known. The earth beneath Hughes's feet opened, not violently. Like an earthquake, but gently, like the land itself was offering him a choice. He could step back onto solid ground and accept that his mission had failed, or he could continue forward into a gap that led down into the heart of the mountain itself. Hughes chose to step forward, whether from desperation, insanity, or simply the inability to accept defeat. The commissioner plunged into the opening in the earth. His scream echoed for a moment, then was cut off as the ground sealed itself behind him, leaving no trace that it had ever been disturbed. The remaining mercenaries and deputies saw their leader vanish into the mountain and lost what little courage they had left. They dropped their weapons and ran, crashing through the underbrush in their panic to escape forces they couldn't understand or fight. In the sudden silence that followed, Tahsina became aware that the sacred stone in her hand had cooled to its normal temperature. The spirit guardians were still present, but their forms had become less intense, more translucent. The immediate threat had passed, but she could sense that larger forces were still in motion. The guardian returned to his normal size and appearance, though the silver light around him remained visible to those who had learned to see beyond the surface of things. He padded over to Tahsina and settled beside her, his presence offering comfort and strength as she tried to process what had just happened. "Is it over?" Maria Crowfeather asked, emerging from the forest where she had taken shelter with the children. Tom Big Bear shook his head grimly. "This was just the first wave. The company has too much invested to give up after one setback. They'll be back with more men, heavier weapons, maybe even federal troops." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching helicopters could be heard in the distance. Multiple aircraft this time, flying in formation and approaching from several directions at once. The company's backup plan was already in motion. Mayor Collins rode his horse closer to the group, his face pale but determined. "Mrs. Running Bear, the town council needs to take a formal position on this situation. What you've shown us tonight, it changes everything. We thought we knew about this." Valley, Tahsina looked around at the faces, gathered in the clearing, Apache families who had seen their guardian spirits answer an ancient call, townspeople who had witnessed powers they'd never imagined, and the guardian himself, whose true nature was no longer hidden from those he had chosen to protect. "Then you know what you have to choose," she said quietly. "Stand with the sacred places and the people who protect them, or stand with those who would destroy everything for profit." The helicopters were getting closer, their searchlights beginning to sweep the mountainside. Soon this clearing would be illuminated by artificial light, and the next phase of the conflict would begin. But something had changed in the balance of power. The land itself had awakened, and its guardians were no longer hiding their true nature. Whatever came next, it would be faced by forces that the railroad company and its hired guns had never expected to encounter. The real test was just beginning. The helicopters came in low and fast, their searchlights turning night into harsh artificial day. But as the beams swept across the clearing, something extraordinary happened. The light itself began to change, shifting from white to silver as it passed through the spiritual energy that still filled the air around the guardian spirits. "All ground units. This is Air Command," a voice crackled from abandoned radio equipment. "We're showing massive electromagnetic interference. Repeat, massive interference with all electronics. Navigation systems are failing." Tahsina watched as one of the helicopters began to circle erratically, its pilot clearly struggling with controls that no longer responded predictably. The sacred stone in her hand pulsed with warmth, and she realized that the spiritual awakening of the land was affecting everything technological that entered its sphere of influence. "They can't land," Tom Big Bear observed with satisfaction. "The spirits are protecting us from their machines." But even as he spoke, Tahsina could see movement in the valley below, ground forces advancing on foot, abandoning their vehicles as they climbed the mountain paths. These weren't the mercenaries from before, but federal troops in full combat gear, approaching with the disciplined movements of soldiers who had dealt with unusual situations before. Mayor Collins urged his horse closer to Tahsina. "The town council has made its decision. Whatever you need, whatever you're planning to do, Cedar Ridge stands with you. Sam Morrison nodded firmly. "We've seen enough tonight to know which side we belong on. This valley has been our home for decades, but it was sacred ground long before we arrived." The Guardian raised his massive head toward the approaching soldiers, and Tahsina felt his tension like a vibration in the air. These men were different from the mercenaries. They moved with purpose and discipline, and their equipment suggested they were prepared for encounters with unusual phenomena. "Military specialists," Tom Wheeler said grimly, reading the same signs. "They're not here to arrest anybody. They're here to contain what they consider a supernatural threat." The lead elements of the federal force reached the edge of the clearing, taking cover behind trees and rocks with practiced efficiency. Their leader, a colonel with gray hair and cold eyes, raised a bullhorn. "This area is now under federal jurisdiction. All civilians will evacuate immediately or be considered combatants in a matter of national security." "National security?" Maria Crowfeather called back. "We're protecting our homes and our sacred places. How is that a threat to anyone?" "Ma'am, you are harboring entities that represent a clear and present danger to territorial stability and technological infrastructure. This is your final warning to disperse." The Guardian stepped forward, his form beginning to glow again with that inner light that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. Around the clearing, the other spirits began to manifest more clearly. The elk, the bear, the eagle, and the mountain cat, all taking positions that formed a defensive perimeter. "Colonel," Tahsina called out, "these spirits have protected this land for centuries. They've never threatened anyone who came in peace. But they will defend what is sacred from those who come to destroy it." The colonel's response was to signal his men, who raised weapons that Tahsina had never seen before, devices that hummed with electrical energy and cast strange shadows in the silver light of the spirits. "Those are containment weapons," Tom Big Bear said with sudden understanding, "designed to capture spiritual entities. The government has been preparing for something like this." The first shot came without warning, not bullets, but beams of crackling energy that struck the elk's spirit and seemed to wrap around it like glowing chains. The magnificent creature stumbled, its starlight antlers dimming as the technological bindings tried to constrain its spiritual essence. The Guardian's roar of outrage shook the mountain itself. He launched himself toward the soldiers with speed that belonged more to lightning than to any earthly creature. But more energy beams lashed out, catching him in mid-leap and slamming him to the ground in a tangle of crackling restraints. "No!" Tahsina screamed, raising the sacred stone above her head. Power blazed from it like a beacon, and the energy beams wavered and flickered as spiritual force met technological containment. The eagle spirit soared overhead, diving toward the soldiers with talons extended, but more beams reached up to meet it. The bear spirit charged the military line, but found itself similarly entangled in energy that seemed designed specifically to bind spiritual entities. "How do they know how to do this?" Sam Morrison demanded, his face pale with shock at seeing the Guardian spirits being systematically captured. "Because they've been studying us," Tom Big Bear replied grimly. "Studying our legends, our sacred objects, our spiritual practices. They've learned enough to turn our own power against us. But even as the technological bindings tightened around the spirits, something else was happening. The mountain itself was responding to the attack on its guardians, and its response was not limited to spiritual manifestations. The ground beneath the soldiers' feet began to buckle and shift, not randomly, but with clear purpose. Trees that had stood for centuries began to uproot themselves, moving with deliberate intent to block the soldiers' positions. The very rocks began to sing, a deep, harmonic resonance that made the containment weapons malfunction and sparked. "All units fall back to secondary positions," the colonel shouted into his radio. "The terrain is becoming unstable, but there was nowhere to fall back to." The mountain had awakened fully now, and every feature of the landscape, every tree, every stone, every blade of grass, had become part of its defense of the sacred ground. Tahsina felt the sacred stone burning in her hand as power beyond anything she'd ever imagined flowed through her. She could sense the presence of every ancestor who had ever walked this land, every generation that had known and protected its sacred places. They were all here now, lending their strength to the living guardians. "Release them," she called to the colonel, her voice carrying the authority of centuries. "Release the spirits, and your men can leave unharmed." The colonel's response was to order more containment weapons brought to bear, but the devices were sparking and failing as the spiritual energy in the clearing overwhelmed their technological sophistication. That's when the Guardian broke free the energy bindings that had held him dissolved like mist before the sun. As he drew power not just from his own ancient nature, but from the awakened mountain itself, he rose to his full supernatural height, his form blazing with starfire that made the soldiers' night vision equipment useless. "You cannot contain what exists beyond your understanding," he said, his voice echoing from every stone and tree. "You cannot bind what belongs to the very foundations of the world." The other spirits broke free as well, their bonds dissolving as the mountain's power flowed through them. But instead of attacking the soldiers, they began to move in a pattern that Tahsina recognized from her grandmother's stories, a sacred dance that called upon powers older than human civilization. The colonel raised his sidearm, aiming directly at the Guardian. "If we can't contain you, we'll destroy you." His shot rang out across the clearing, echoing like thunder from the mountain walls. But the bullet never found its target. Instead, it struck something that had materialized in the space between the colonel and the Guardian, a figure that Tahsina recognized with wonder and joy. Her grandmother stood there, translucent but unmistakably real, her weathered hand extended to catch the bullet that would have struck the Guardian. Around her, other figures began to appear, ancestors stretching back through generations, all of them standing in defense of the sacred ground. "You would fire upon a place where the spirits of the dead still walk?" her grandmother asked, her voice carrying clearly to every person in the clearing. "You would destroy what connects the living to those who came before?" The colonel's hand shook as he stared at something his military training had never prepared him for. The ancestral spirits filled the clearing now, their presence creating a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of those who had passed on. "Stand down," came a new voice from behind the military line. A figure in civilian clothes approached, an older man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to ultimate authority. "Stand down immediately." The colonel lowered his weapon reluctantly. "Sir, the containment operation is terminated, Colonel. These are not hostile entities. They are the guardians of a sacred site that our government has treaty obligations to protect." Tahsina stared at the newcomer, recognizing something familiar in his weathered features. "You're Apache," she said with sudden understanding. "I am Senator Joseph Crow Dog," he replied, stepping into the circle of silver light without hesitation. "And I have spent the last 6 hours convincing the President that this operation represents a violation of every treaty the United States has ever signed with the Apache people." The colonel's face flushed with anger. "Sir, with respect, the railroad company has legitimate development rights. The railroad company has been operating under fraudulent surveys and corrupted legal documents," Senator Crow Dog interrupted. "Federal investigators have been building a case against them for months. This entire operation was designed to eliminate evidence of their illegal activities." He withdrew a sheaf of official documents from his coat. "As of 1 hour ago, all Colorado and Pacific Railroad operations in this territory have been suspended pending a full federal investigation. Their land claims have been invalidated and their corporate charter is under review." The guardian spirits began to fade back to their normal transparency, though their presence remained strong. The mountain itself seemed to settle, the supernatural activity diminishing to a background hum that spoke of watchful protection rather than active defense. "Furthermore," the senator continued, "this entire valley has been designated as a protected cultural site under federal law. No mining, no railroad construction, no development of any kind without explicit approval from both the territorial government and the Apache Tribal Council. Tahsina felt the sacred stone cool in her hand as the immediate threat passed. Around her, the faces of her people showed the kind of cautious hope that came from victories too long delayed and too often snatched away. "What about the company's hired guns?" Tom Big Bear asked. "Or what about the men who tried to murder families protecting their homes?" Senator Crow Dog's expression hardened. Federal marshals are already moving to arrest the surviving mercenaries and company officials. "Those who can be found anyway." He glanced meaningfully toward the spot where Hughes had disappeared into the mountain. "Some appear to have encountered more immediate justice." The colonel was speaking quietly into his radio, ordering his troops to stand down and prepare for withdrawal. The containment weapons were being secured, and the soldiers were backing away from the clearing with obvious relief. "This doesn't end here," the colonel said quietly to Senator Crow Dog. "There are forces in the government that won't accept the existence of what we've seen tonight. Then those forces will have to deal with me, Colonel, and with others who understand that this nation's strength comes from honoring its sacred places, not destroying them." The senator's voice carried the weight of political power backed by moral authority. The age of treating indigenous peoples as obstacles to progress is over. As the military forces withdrew, the helicopters struggling to navigate through the lingering electromagnetic interference, Tahsina found herself standing in a clearing that had been transformed by the night's events. The sacred ground was still sacred, but now its protection was acknowledged by forces that had previously denied its very existence. The Guardian padded over to her, his massive form once again appearing as a large but ordinary dog to those who lacked the sight to see deeper truths. But Tahsina would never again mistake him for anything merely ordinary. She had seen his true nature, felt the power that flowed through him from sources older than human memory. "Is it really over?" she asked quietly. The Guardian looked toward the valley below, where the lights of retreating vehicles could be seen winding their way back toward town. "This battle is over, but there will be others. There will always be those who see only profit where others see the sacred. Then you'll stay. You'll continue to protect this place?" The Guardian's ancient eyes met hers, and in them she saw something that made her heart full, not just duty or obligation, but genuine affection for the woman who had been willing to sacrifice everything to stand beside him. "I will stay as long as you need me. As long as this land needs protection. As long as there are those who remember that some things are worth more than gold or coal or the promise of easy wealth." Around them, the spirit guardians were fading back into the deep places of the mountain, their work for this night completed. But Tahsina knew they would always be there, watching and waiting, ready to answer the call if the sacred places were threatened again. The land remembered everything, and now, finally, so did the people who lived upon it. 6 months later, Tahsina stood on her porch watching the morning sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. The federal investigation had ended with the complete dismantling of the Colorado and Pacific Railroad Company, their executives facing trial for fraud, corruption, and conspiracy. The coal deposits remained untouched beneath the sacred ground, protected now by laws that acknowledged what Apache people had always known, that some places were too precious to be measured in dollars and cents. The Guardian emerged from his favorite sleeping spot beneath the old oak tree, stretching with the casual grace she'd come to love. To most visitors, he still appeared to be simply a very large dog, but those who had been present during the night of awakening could see him as he truly was, a bridge between worlds, a protector of what was sacred. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the path from town. A small group was making its way up the mountain, Senator Crow Dog leading, followed by representatives from the territorial government and several members of the Apache Tribal Council. Today was the day they would formally dedicate the valley as a protected cultural preserve. but more important to Tahsina was the second group approaching from the opposite direction. Apache families who had been scattered across the territory were returning to the valley, drawn by news that the old ways were being honored once again. Among them walked Joseph White Hawk, the ancient medicine man who had helped her understand the Guardian's true nature. "Grandfather," she called out as the elder approached her cabin. "You've made a long journey." White Hawk smiled, his weathered face creasing with genuine joy. "Not so long, child. I've been waiting my entire life to see this day, when the spirits walk openly among the people again, when the sacred places are protected by the very laws that once threatened to destroy them." The Guardian padded over to greet the old man, who placed a reverent hand on the massive head. "And you, old friend, you have kept your promise. The people are protected, the land is safe, and the bridge between worlds remains strong." As the two groups converged in the meadow, where Joseph's grave lay beneath its cairn of river stones, Tahsina felt a deep sense of completion. The stone marker was now surrounded by wildflowers that seemed to grow more abundantly each season, as if the land itself was offering tribute to the man who had helped his wife understand her destiny. Senator Crow Dog approached with the formal documents that would make the protection permanent. "Mrs. Running Bear, it gives me great honor to present these papers establishing the Running Bear Valley Cultural Preserve. The federal government formally recognizes this land as sacred to the Apache people and protected in perpetuity. The new land deed, crafted with care and witnessed by representatives of 3 governments, bore seals and signatures that guaranteed what violence and corruption had failed to destroy." Tahsina accepted the document with hands that didn't shake, feeling the weight of responsibility and the lightness of victory in equal measure. "There's something else," the senator continued, producing a second set of papers. "The territorial government has appointed you as the first official guardian of the preserve. The position comes with federal authority to protect not just this valley, but any sacred sites throughout the territory that may face similar threats." Tahsina looked down at the appointment papers, seeing her name inscribed in official script that made her role as protector a matter of legal record as well as spiritual calling. Round her, the faces of her people showed pride and satisfaction. The woman who had stood alone against impossible odds was now empowered to ensure others would never have to face such trials without support. "I accept," she said simply, "on behalf of all those who came before and all those who will come after." The ceremony that followed blended Apache traditions with territorial formalities, creating something new that honored both cultures. White Hawk offered prayers in the old language, while Senator Crow Dog spoke of a future where progress and preservation could coexist. Children who had been born on the reservation ran freely through the meadows where their ancestors had walked, and families began making plans to build new homes in the valley their great-grandparents had known. As the sun reached its zenith, casting everything in clear, bright light, Tahsina found herself standing beside the Guardian at the edge of the ceremonial ground. The sacred stone in her pocket had grown warm, not with the burning intensity of battle, but with the gentle heat of contentment. "Do you think they'll really leave us in peace?" she asked quietly. The Guardian's attention was focused on something in the distance, a golden eagle soaring high above the mountains, riding the thermals with effortless grace. "Peace is not something that is given, my friend. It is something that must be maintained, day by day, season by season, generation by generation. Then you'll stay, even now that the immediate danger is past." The ancient eyes turned to her, and in them she saw not just the wisdom of centuries, but something warmer and more personal. "You stood with me when the world seemed determined to destroy what we both held sacred. You chose to see truth over appearance, spirit over flesh, courage over comfort. Why would I leave when I have finally found someone worthy of the bond we share?" That evening, as the officials and visitors made their way back to their various homes, Tahsina sat on her porch with a cup of tea and watched the Guardian patrol the boundaries of their land. The routine had become as familiar as breathing, the careful inspection of fence lines, The alert attention to sounds from the forest, the gentle investigation of any scent or sign that might indicate visitors approaching. But tonight there was something different in his manner, a sense of satisfaction and settled purpose that hadn't been there before. The threats that had driven him from hiding were gone. The sacred places were protected by law as well as spirit, and the people he had sworn to guard were safe to live according to their own traditions. The mountains settled into their evening quiet, and Tahsina pulled one of Joseph's old blankets around her shoulders. The stars emerged one by one overhead, the same patterns her grandmother had taught her to read as a child. But now she understood that the stories they told were not just ancient myths. They were living realities that continued to unfold with each passing day. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the valley. But this train was carrying supplies and visitors to the new cultural preserve, not seeking to destroy what it found. The sound that had once represented threat and displacement now spoke of connection and support, of a world learning to honor what was sacred rather than simply exploit what was profitable. The guardian completed his evening patrol and returned to settle beside her chair, his massive presence offering comfort and protection as it had every night for the past 6 months. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new opportunities to protect the sacred places of the world. But tonight, for the first time since Joseph's death, Tahsina felt completely at peace. She had found her purpose, her people were safe, and beside her sat a guardian who had chosen to share his ancient wisdom with a woman brave enough to stand for what she believed. The land remembered everything, every battle fought for its protection, every generation that had called it home, every spirit that had walked between its mountains and meadows. And now it would remember this too, the night when the modern world finally learned to listen to the old songs, and the woman who had helped teach it how to hear them. Some bonds, Tahsina reflected as she stroked the guardian's magnificent head, were indeed formed in the most unexpected places. But once formed, they lasted forever, connecting past to future, spirit to flesh, and the sacred to the everyday world that so desperately needed to remember what was truly worth protecting. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and the mountains stood sentinel as they had for countless generations. In the valley below, the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled like earthbound stars, and somewhere in the distance, the guardian spirits of the land continued their eternal watch. All was well, all was as it should be, and in the morning, the work of protection would continue.